Picture this. You were a music executive in 2006, and two men by the names of Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzen pitch you the idea of a new music service where users will have the option to pay monthly to have access to a full selection of your record company's discography. They tell you that this will fix the music industry, which has been collapsing ever since its peak in the late 90s. At this point, the music industry had a choice. They knew that consumers wanted music to be on demand. Apple's solution with iTunes had begun to save the industry from losing too much revenue from piracy, but they knew they still had to be ahead of the curve on this, and so they agreed. Little did they know at this point, but giving the go-ahead for Spotify would be one of the most significant changes to the music industry since the invention of the microphone, and would have major effects on the industry as a whole, all the way from how bands and artists make music to how fans listen to it, even to the way that the industry made, or should I say starts to not make, money. The truth is, the peak of music sales that Spotify was proposed to return the industry back to would actually never come. In fact, they may have made it so that they may never reach them again, all the while bringing other unrelated industries into its chaos. And here's how it all happened. The idea of Spotify is not a unique one. Ever since the internet started, the idea of consumers no longer having to go to a record store to pick up a full-priced album just for maybe one or two songs that they actually like to be on it, and instead being able to listen to just the songs they wanted to, was something that people wanted. And Spotify's pitch is essentially just that. All the convenience of radio, but with the choice of being able to have the full selection of a record shop. Of course, Spotify was not the first to market with this. Instead, services like LimeWire and Napster were the original disruptors of the industry, with the industry going straight ahead and shutting them down almost as quickly as they started. But the cat was out of the bag, and consumers did want that convenience that LimeWire and Napster provided, with iTunes coming later in 2001 with a more industry-friendly approach, with albums being $9.99 and individual tracks being 99 cents. However, Spotify wanted to bridge the two together, having both a paid and subscription tier available to users, with Daniel Ek, one of the co-founders and current CEO, going on to say, "The only way to solve the problem was to create a service that was better than piracy and at the same time compensates the music industry. That gave us Spotify." And yeah, paying a monthly subscription is better for the music industry than, well, paying nothing, as he predicted. But I don't think that when he was pitching this to them, they just knew how much the industry would have to shift and break itself apart to go in this direction. Otherwise, I don't think they would have gone ahead with it. In fact, there was actually a time in the early days where Spotify was both its own subscription model and the more iTunes-focused model, where when you bought gift cards for the service, you had a choice to just straight up buy the tracks that you wanted. I do wonder if anyone still has and listens to the songs that they permanently bought back in the day from Spotify. I doubt it. In fact, the idea that you no longer own anything is an idea that Spotify populated themselves, but we will talk more about that later. Spotify tried a whole lot of other things before they landed on the business model that they use today. For example, they have tried a trial period where after a while, users then had to pay. They also tried having limits, like the ones they had when they launched in America, where each user was eventually limited to only 5 plays per song and only 10 hours of streaming per month. Of course, this was not going to work in the long run, as it only gave consumers the choice that they wanted, but far from the convenience they had come to expect. Eventually, Spotify did land on the compromise that we know today, where you can have pretty much free choice over what music you hear, but you will get adverts every few songs, not unlike the radio. But it is here where one of Spotify's main problems arises, as their business model is very restricting to them. It turns out ads and an optional $9.99 a month subscription, which we know most users don't choose to pay for, doesn't leave a whole lot of money left when you have to pay the bill for all the 100 million songs that the service provides. Now, we know most subscription services increase their prices over time, but it does seem that Spotify has been fairly reluctant to do that over the years. And well, you might be right in thinking, why don't they just increase the prices to compensate for this? It's simple enough, right? Well, to tell you why they can't do that, I first must introduce you to Spotify's next problem, that's just starting to grow over 5,000 miles away over in sunny Cupertino. In 2012, Beats, the headphone company, was starting to work on their own subscription service to compete with Spotify, even going as far to hire Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails fame to be the chief creative officer of what they were internally calling Project Daisy, but eventually named Beats Music. Eventually, the service set its launch date for January 2014. Later in May of that same year, however, Apple announced that they were going to buy both Beats headphones and the music division for about $3 billion. Now, Apple knows how to make headphones and speakers, so I can't help but feel like a huge part of why Apple made the Beats acquisition, which I might add is the biggest of all time for them, was likely in part due to the fact that Beats Music would allow them to fast track their own service and bring it to market much quicker. And they did, with Apple Music officially being announced on June 8, 2015 at the company's Worldwide Developer Conference and being officially released 22 days later. This was instantly a problem for Spotify, as it's almost impossible to compete against a competitor who provides the exact same service as you on anything other than price. The difference between Spotify and Apple Music isn't like the difference between, let's say, Apple TV Plus and Netflix. Both of those services provide completely different catalogues of movies and TV shows, and so they can justify to consumers having different price points at different times. At the end of the day, for the most part, Apple Music and Spotify have the exact same songs and albums as each other, and so consumers will likely just go for the one that is the cheapest. And because Apple is a much bigger company who sells products outside of Apple Music, they can afford to lose money more than Spotify can. At the end of the day, Spotify is their only business. It's no coincidence that the only real competition that we have seen come to Spotify is from businesses that can afford to lose money because they're successful in other areas, like Google with YouTube Music and Amazon, with both of these subscription models all being the ones to set the price, along with Apple Music. So, if Spotify increases the prices, they will lose subscribers to Apple or their other competitors, so they have to wait for Apple and the others to be the ones to bring in the price increase, but Apple can afford not to, and so essentially keep Spotify from increasing their prices as well. This makes it so that Spotify is stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't lower their cost because the record labels get to decide how much the music they own costs to lend out, and they also can't increase their prices because Apple and the others in the industry are the ones who also get to set the price of their product. Add to this the fact that Apple takes an up to 30% cut on all revenue that is made on their App Store. It means that Spotify has to pay Apple a cut out of the money that they make, that Apple themselves obviously don't have to pay. But don't feel too bad for Spotify. Nobody made Daniel Ek sell other people's music for almost nothing. He planned that all himself. In 2017, Billboard named Daniel Ek the most powerful person in the music industry, which is a strange thing for a CEO of a company who had yet to have a profitable year to be named. In fact, Spotify only had its first profitable year last year, and we can assume most of that was due to the mass layoffs and ghost artists that they have allegedly been filling the platform with, but more on that later. Despite him being the most powerful person in the music industry, he is far from the most popular, and it's no surprise when he says things like, "Obviously some artists that used to do well in the past may not do well in this future landscape, where you can't record music once every 3 to 4 years and think that's going to be enough." It's no wonder he gets reactions like these. I mean, if Spotify themselves are struggling to make a profit on this broken system, how are the artists that populate these platforms supposed to make a living? Well, they kind of don't. The way Spotify makes its money is from ads and subscriptions, as we know. All of this money is collected into one large sum of cash and is then distributed out to the rights holders of the music, like the record companies, whose job it is then to distribute it to the artists themselves based on their already pre-agreed terms that they have with them. Spotify's video that they have explaining this really tries not to use any specific numbers and essentially comes down to, we give the record labels billions and let them figure it out. Which, I mean, it's no real wonder why artists are annoyed when they can't see what these deals are that Spotify has with their rights holders. Now, as we discussed before, Spotify's music business is one that is stuck, and they have very little room for them to grow when it comes to music, and any growth that they do have has to be the same or even cheaper than their competitors. For example, when it comes to high fidelity audio, we have known for some time now that Spotify has wanted to have a more expensive tier of their premium subscription that would come with higher quality audio. However, when Apple Music launched their high fidelity audio mode at no additional cost, it put Spotify in a funny position, as if they're not charging extra for additional service, it's going to be a whole lot harder for them to justify the extra cost, and so it's likely a reason why we haven't seen them, despite it being in the works for far longer than their competitors. A second industry that Spotify has tried to move into has been that of podcasting, with varying degrees of success. Expensive acquisitions, with them paying Meghan and Harry $20 million for just 12 episodes in return, and the reported $20 million acquisition of the Joe Rogan Experience, which went on to be a bit of a disaster for Spotify, as due to an episode that contained COVID-19 misinformation, many artists including Neil Young and Joni Mitchell famously decided to leave the site for a stretch of 2 years. In total, the company had spent $400 million on podcast acquisitions, with very little but mass layoffs to show for it. In fact, even the Joe Rogan podcast went back to being available on other platforms. It even got Eck to say, on a conference call, "You're right in calling out the overpaying and overinvesting. We're going to be very diligent on how we invest in future content deals, and the ones that aren't performing, obviously, we won't renew." Likewise, the company has also tried to implement audiobooks to the service in a way to compete with other services like Audible, which is backed up by Amazon. With the podcast and the audiobooks existing on the same app, it's interesting to think where the service could try and go next, as it's clear at this point that the music alone is not going to keep the Spotify ship afloat. But even with physical products like Car Thing, which they shut down in 2024, it seems like they are struggling to find users to care about their other ventures, most of which they hope will become more profitable than the music. But by far the quickest way to make your music service profitable is just to fill your playlist with stock music from fake artists. From what I could find, this was first reported by Music Business Worldwide in 2016, that Spotify were allegedly paying some musicians a flat fee to create music like jazz, chill and peaceful piano playing, all to be listed under made-up names. Despite this, Music Business Worldwide could not provide any specific examples of the artists that they knew were fake, just that they had sources that knew about this. A year later, in 2017, adding more credibility, Vulture magazine reported, quote, "Spotify is reportedly gaming the system by paying producers to produce songs that are then placed on the service's massively popular playlists under the names of unknown or non-existent artists, paying the artists far less than the fat streaming checks that come with plump playlist placements." This then of course allows Spotify to save money with them not having to pay real artists under their real names. After both these articles, Spotify released a statement to Billboard saying, quote, "We do not and have never created fake artists and put them on Spotify playlist. Categorically untrue, full stop. We pay royalties, sound and publishing for all tracks on Spotify, and for everything we playlist, we do not own rights. We're not a label. Our music is licensed from rights holders, and we pay them. We do not pay ourselves." However, by the end of 2017, a journalist called Liz Pelly also reported that a record label owner was in contact with her over what was described as stock music attributed to pseudonymous musicians, variously called ghost artist or fake artist, with her going on to say that others in the music industry are beginning to grow concerned with this. All of this came to a head 5 years later, when in 2022 a Swedish newspaper called Dagens Nyheter claimed that over 500 fabricated names were being used by 20 different musicians on Spotify. In the end, they found around 830 fake artists, but most damning against Spotify, 495 of these were placed in the company's own official playlists. The fake artist story would not stop here, however, with Liz Pelly from before visiting Dagens Nyheter, the newspaper that was also mentioned before, about both of these reports on the fake artist stories. She said that she spoke with former employees, reviewed internal Spotify records and company Slack messages, and interviewed and corresponded with numerous musicians. This all allegedly showed that Spotify internally has an internal strategy called Perfect Fit Content, where Spotify staff look for content that could fill out the company's own made playlists. She theorized that the company likely realized that users were just listening to music in the background in a lot of their playlists the company makes, with one employee actually telling her, as a result, the thinking seemed to be, why pay full price royalties if users were only half listening? She goes on to suggest that, quote, "It was likely from this reasoning that the Perfect Fit content program was created." With this Perfect Fit content program at Spotify, employees were being tasked with filling playlists with tracks that Spotify would be able to pay less royalties on, even when they didn't fit with the rest of the playlist quite as well, with one employee telling Liz, quote, We didn't like that it was these two guys that normally write pop songs replacing swaths of artists across the board. It's just not fair, but it was like trying to stop a train that was already leaving. At the end of her article, Liz writes about how Spotify employees she spoke to had concerns over how the perfect fit content strategy may be expanded in the future, especially when it comes to the company using artificial intelligence to power it. And she finished her article with a quote from the man who started it all, Spotify CEO Daniel Ek, with her saying, quote, "During a 2023 conference call, Daniel Ek noted that the boom in AI-generated content could be great culturally and allow Spotify to grow engagement and revenue." Now, of course, some of the articles that I mentioned say the full scale of this issue may not even be clear to Spotify themselves. Whilst it seems at the moment they are at least not making the tracks themselves, they are internally finding and using ghost artists on their platform, all in their own playlists, to have better profit margins and keep real artists from being paid the amount that they should be for those very placements. It's very likely other people as well are also creating ghost artists on the platform, but whether it's them, themselves, or other companies working with Spotify behind this, it's clear to see that they are choosing to do nothing about it. The full article, titled "The Ghosts in the Machine" by Liz Pelly, which I reference in the final part of this video, is linked below, and I recommend you give it a read, along with all the other texts that I have referenced also being linked down below. In fact, in Liz Pelly's full piece, she goes on to speak to real artists who create the music that Spotify uses in their perfect fit content strategy. When I started on this video, I didn't expect to find out about all the ghost artists, as this was originally supposed to just be a video covering the history of Spotify and the rise of streaming services as a whole. Much like the video I've already made on Vevo and how that has changed the music video industry. In fact, the original Apple Music section of this video was much more in-depth, but as the video has gotten bigger and bigger, I decided to save that for a different video altogether, as I went down a rabbit hole there about all the different patents that Apple owns on music playback devices alone. But until then, thanks for watching.